One social media thread. 9 posts. That's all it took to turn a debate about trans athletes into an allegation that could blow up an entire WNBA front office. Because right now, the Indiana Fever are sitting on a claim that a male staffer was fired for sexual harassment and that players were told to keep quiet about it. And the only reason we know that is because a former player decided enough was enough and said it out loud. Welcome back to the channel. This story has way more layers than most people realize, and by the end of today's video, we're going to walk through the timeline, the players involved, the history behind this debate, the legal side of workplace retaliation claims, how the league has handled similar situations before, and what might happen next. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Sophie Cunningham, Brianna Turner, and the Indiana Fever. What looked like a simple culture war flashpoint has become something much bigger and much messier. We've got competing narratives, an organization that won't confirm or deny anything, and a former player who just detonated a bombshell in the middle of an already tense news cycle. Who are the players? Before we get into the controversy itself, let's make sure everyone's on the same page about who's actually involved here, because if you don't follow the WNBA closely, some of these names might be new to you. Sophie Cunningham, guard for the Indiana Fever, known as much for her physical, no-nonsense style of play as she is for being outspoken off the court. She's built a reputation as someone who doesn't shy away from confrontation, whether that's standing up for teammates on the floor or sharing her opinions publicly. Fans either love her energy or find her polarizing. There's not a lot of middle ground with her public persona, and that's part of why her comments carried so much weight. Brianna Turner, a veteran forward who spent time with the Fever last season before signing with the Las Vegas Aces. Turner has a long track record in the league, including all-defensive first-team honors, and she's also served in a leadership capacity with the Players' Union. That's an important detail, because it means when Turner speaks about workplace conditions, she's not just a random voice, she's someone who's had a formal role advocating for players across the league. Cheryl Reeve, head coach of the Minnesota Lynx and one of the most respected voices in the WNBA coaching ranks. She's not shy about wading into league-wide issues, and her comments added fuel to an already heated conversation. The Indiana Fever organization, obviously the team at the center of this, and the one now facing pressure to respond to Turner's allegation with more than a carefully worded statement. Got all that? Good. Let's get into the actual timeline. The spark. This whole thing traces back to an ESPN feature where Sophie Cunningham was asked directly about transgender athletes competing in women's sports. Her answer was blunt. She said she wants to protect young girls both in the locker room and in competition who she believes shouldn't have to compete against biological men. Now, right away, this split into predictable camps. Supporters saw this as someone finally saying out loud what they'd been thinking privately, a defense of what they view as fairness and safety in women's sports. Critics saw it as targeting a small, already marginalized group of athletes with rhetoric that paints an entire community as a threat, especially given that, at the time these comments were made, there had been exactly one openly transgender player in WNBA history and no reported incidents tied to her presence in the league. That statistic matters, and we're going to come back to it, because it's one of the central disagreements in this whole debate. Is this a policy conversation about a real and growing issue, or is it a symbolic fight over a hypothetical that isn't actually playing out at the professional level? The broader debate. Let's zoom out for a second, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. The question of transgender participation in women's sports has been building for years, from state legislatures passing bans on trans athletes in school sports, to international governing bodies in track and swimming adjusting eligibility rules, to Title IX itself becoming a political football in Washington. There are a few core arguments you'll hear repeated on each side, and I want to lay them out fairly, because I think a lot of commentary on this topic skips straight to yelling instead of explaining. The case for restricting participation, as advocates for it usually frame it, centers on physiological differences that persist even after hormone therapy, bone density, muscle mass distribution, cardiovascular capacity, and the argument that decades of Title IX protections exist specifically because those differences matter competitively. Advocates argue that erasing that line risks undoing the entire point of having separate women's categories in the first place. The case for inclusion, on the other hand, usually points to the actual data. Extremely small numbers of transgender athletes competing at any level, let alone professionally, and even fewer documented cases of competitive advantage translating into dominance. Advocates for inclusion argue that broad restrictions end up policing all women's bodies, leading to invasive scrutiny of cisgender athletes who don't fit a narrow physical mold, while doing little to address any actual, measurable problem in elite sport. Both sides claim they're protecting women's sports. They just disagree completely on what the threat actually is. And that's part of why this conversation is so combustible. It's not really a disagreement over facts as much as it's a disagreement over which risk matters more, a hypothetical competitive imbalance, or the real exclusion of an already small and vulnerable group. I'm not going to tell you which side is right. That's not really my job here, and honestly, reasonable people who care about women's sports land in different places on this. What I can tell you is that this is the backdrop Cunningham's comments landed on, which is why they blew up the way they did. Cheryl Reeve weighs in. Not long after Cunningham's comments circulated, Lynx head coach Cheryl Reeve pushed back publicly, arguing that transgender athletes have become a political target in a way that's disproportionate to any actual issue in the league. Her argument echoed the inclusion side of the debate we just laid out, that sports are supposed to build confidence, community, and opportunity, and that carving a group out of that undermines the whole premise. Reeve's comments didn't end the conversation. If anything, they intensified it, because now you had a sitting head coach publicly disagreeing, at least implicitly, with a player from a division rival. That's the kind of thing that makes a story that would have stayed on social media start showing up in every basketball outlet's headlines. The turn. Brianna Turner. And this is where the story stops being just about Cunningham. Brianna Turner didn't just respond to the trans athlete debate directly. She reframed the entire conversation. In a multi-post thread, she pointed out that the league's one openly trans player had caused 0 documented problems, and then pivoted to what she framed as the actual threat to players, the organizations themselves. Then came the allegation that changed everything. Turner said that last season, a male staffer with a fever was fired for sexual harassment, and that players were encouraged to keep quiet about it. She didn't stop there. She tied it into a broader list of workplace issues she said deserve just as much attention as the trans athlete debate: sexism, misogyny, homophobia, and racism. That's a serious claim, and I want to be really careful about how we talk about this part, because there's a difference between reporting that someone made an allegation and treating that allegation as an established fact. As of right now, this is Turner's account. The Fever have not confirmed the specifics, and there's no public confirmation of whether a formal complaint was filed, whether law enforcement was ever involved, or what internal process, if any, was followed. That said, allegations like this don't come from nowhere, and once a respected veteran with a union leadership background puts her name on a claim like this, it's not something a franchise can just wait out. The Fever's response. So how did the Indiana Fever respond? Carefully. Very carefully. Their statement said that protecting players and employees is their top priority, that their policy is to take concerns seriously, investigate thoroughly, and act when appropriate. And then, critically, they said they don't comment on personnel matters involving former employees. That last line is doing a lot of work. It's the kind of statement that sounds responsive without actually confirming or denying a single detail of what Turner said. From a legal and HR standpoint, that's actually a pretty standard move. Organizations are often advised not to discuss personnel matters publicly, both to protect the privacy of everyone involved and to avoid saying something that could complicate a legal situation down the line. But from a public trust standpoint, it leaves a lot of open questions. Was the staffer actually fired for the reason Turner describes? Was there a formal investigation? Were players actually told to stay quiet? And if so, by whom and how? None of that has been answered, and that vacuum is exactly why speculation is filling in the gaps online right now. What we still don't know. Let's be really clear about the state of the facts as of today. We don't know whether a formal police report was ever filed regarding the alleged harassment. We don't know whether the league office has opened, or plans to open, any kind of independent investigation. We don't know the identity of the staffer, what specific conduct was alleged, or the timeline of when the firing actually took place relative to when it happened. And we don't know exactly what players were told, if anything, about staying quiet, whether that was an explicit instruction or an inferred expectation. Turner hasn't provided additional detail beyond her initial thread, and it's worth noting she may have very good reasons for that. From respecting the privacy of anyone involved, to legal advice, to simply not wanting to turn a workplace issue into a spectacle beyond what she already felt needed to be said publicly. Cunningham's response to the fallout. Through all of this, Cunningham hasn't walked anything back. In follow-up interviews, she's continued to say she doesn't hate the trans community, that she believes in extending love, but that she also believes there are protections for biological women in sport worth standing firm on, and that she's not changing her position because of criticism. She's also talked about how she processes public backlash generally, saying she doesn't spend much energy on either the praise or the hate, because she knows both are coming no matter what she says. Whether you agree with her position or not, that kind of consistency under pressure is part of why her comments landed as hard as they did. She didn't hedge, and she hasn't backpedaled. Why these two stories collided. Here's what I think is the most interesting part of this whole saga. These are genuinely two separate issues that only got linked because of timing and personal history between the two players. Issue 1 is a sincere, ongoing policy debate about fairness, inclusion, and safety in women's sports, the kind of conversation that's happening in legislatures, sports federations, and locker rooms across the country, with people on both sides who genuinely believe they're protecting women's sports. Issue 2 is a specific, serious allegation about how one organization allegedly handled, or mishandled, a sexual harassment complaint, and whether players were pressured into silence about it. The only reason these are being discussed together is that Turner used her platform, in the moment when Cunningham's comments were already circulating, to redirect attention toward what she sees as a more pressing issue. That's a strategic and pointed move, deliberately reframing what threatens women's sports away from trans inclusion and toward institutional accountability. Some people will see that as a savvy, legitimate rhetorical strategy. Others will see it as changing the subject to avoid a harder conversation. Both readings are out there in the discourse right now, and I don't think there's a clean, obvious answer for which one is correct. It depends a lot on what you already believed walking in. The larger pattern: workplace accountability in pro sports. This isn't happening in isolation either. Professional sports leagues, the WNBA included, have dealt with a string of workplace conduct issues in recent years, from front office culture complaints to fan behavior investigations to disputes over how organizations handle internal complaints against staff. The WNBA in particular has had to respond to reports involving alleged fan misconduct toward players, as well as league-level investigations into conduct at games. So there's already a pattern of the league stepping in when incidents become public, which raises the question of whether something similar happens here, whether the league office feels pressure to open its own inquiry into how the Fever organization handled this internally, separate from anything the team itself says. If that happens, it would mark a pretty significant escalation, turning this from a team-level statement into a league-level accountability question. If it doesn't happen, that silence is likely to become its own story, with people asking why a serious allegation from a respected veteran player didn't trigger any additional scrutiny. The media and fan reaction. Predictably, this has completely taken over WNBA discourse. You've got fans calling the Fever's front office everything under the sun without a shred of confirmed detail. You've got others defending Cunningham as someone who simply said what she believes and is being unfairly dragged for it. You've got a third group entirely focused on Turner, praising her for using her platform to spotlight what she sees as a real workplace issue, while others accuse her of deflecting from the original conversation about trans inclusion. And this is the part that I think gets lost in these viral moments. Everybody is having a slightly different argument. Some people are debating trans inclusion in sports. Some are debating institutional accountability and workplace harassment. Some are debating whether Turner's timing was fair to Cunningham. And some are just picking a side based on which player they already liked more. All of those conversations are happening at once, under the same hashtag, which is exactly why this story feels so chaotic to follow if you're just scrolling through your feed. What to watch for next? So where does this go from here? A few things worth keeping an eye on. First, does the Indiana Fever organization say anything more specific, or does their carefully worded statement stand as their final word? Second, does Brianna Turner add any further detail, whether that's identifying the nature of the allegation more specifically or clarifying the "encouraged to stay quiet" claim? Third, does the WNBA league office get involved in any formal capacity, either commenting publicly or opening some kind of review? And fourth, does this affect the ongoing trans athlete conversation at all, or does it end up as a completely separate storyline that just happened to launch from the same news cycle? Any one of those four threads could dominate headlines over the next few weeks, and depending on which one moves first, this story could look completely different by the time we're talking about it again. So that's the full picture as we know it right now. Two separate but collided controversies, a franchise giving a statement that answers nothing directly, and a debate about women's sports that isn't going away anytime soon. I want to be upfront that I'm not here to tell you which side of the trans athlete debate to land on, or to declare Turner's allegation true or false before we actually know more. What I can tell you is that both conversations deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms, instead of getting flattened into one big shouting match on social media. Let me know in the comments which part of this story you think deserves more attention, the sports policy debate or the workplace allegation, and I'll see you in the next one. Like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.